Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture videos, and this is the second video of chapter 7. In this video, I'm going to talk about some features of ordinary shares. So in discussing these features, I will focus on shareholders' rights and dividend payments. For preference shares, I will explain what preference means, and I will also discuss that whether preferred shares are really a debt or equity. So first of all, ordinary shares features. The term ordinary share means different things to different people, but it is usually applied to a share where the holder has no priority in being paid a dividend or receiving a capital distribution in the event of the firm goes into liquidation. For example, the bankruptcy of a firm. What an ordinary shareholder does have is a claim over the residual assets of the firm. I discussed this residual claim term earlier, which means that what is left over after all other claimants have been paid. Okay. Now, the conceptual structure of the corporation assumes that shareholders elect directors who in turn hire management to carry out their directives. So shareholders therefore control the corporation through the right to elect directors. Generally, only shareholders have these rights, so voting rights, which is the most important feature of an ordinary share. In principle, directors are elected each year at an annual meeting. Although there are exceptions, the general idea is one share, one vote, not one shareholder, one vote. Okay, so corporate democracy is thus very different from our political democracy. With corporate democracy, this golden rule prevails absolutely. Directors are elected at an annual shareholders meeting by a vote of shareholders of a majority of shares who are present and entitled to vote. In Australia, for firms listed on the ASX, Australian Securities Exchange as their home exchange, we have a straight voting system of directors of the firm. So a straight voting system means the directors are elected one at a time, and very simply, the shareholders with the majority of votes elects their desired directors. Okay, the only way to guarantee a seat on the board is to own 50% of the firm plus one share. This is also guarantees that you will win every time. So it is really all or nothing. Okay. A straight voting can freeze out minority shareholders in electing the directors they want. One way to try to reduce the influence of majority shareholders is to stagger the voting for the board of directors. With staggered elections, only a fraction of the directorships are up for election at a particular time. In the case of a typical Australian company, members of the board of directors are elected for a term of 3 years, and therefore at the annual general meeting, only 1/3 of the directors is up for re-election. Technically speaking, with this staggered voting, if a new major shareholder wanted to change the board, they would only be able to change 1/3 of the directors in a year. Okay. Overall, staggering has two basic effects. Staggering makes it more difficult for a minority to elect a director because there are fewer directors to be elected at one time. And staggering makes takeover attempt less likely to be successful because it lengthens the time that it will take for a new major shareholder to vote in a majority of the board. We should note that staggering may serve some beneficial purpose too. It provides institutional memory, that is continuity on the board of directors. This may be important for corporations with significant long-range plans and projects. Okay, now let's talk a little about proxy voting. A proxy is the grant of authority by a shareholder to someone else to vote the shareholders' shares. Okay, so for convenience, much of the voting in large corporation is actually done by proxy. Okay, With a straight voting, each share has one vote. The owner of 10,000 shares has 10,000 votes. Large companies have hundreds or even thousands of shareholders. Shareholders can come to the annual meeting and vote in person, or they can transfer their right to vote to another party. Obviously, management always tries to get as many proxies as possible transferred to it. However, if shareholders are not satisfied with management, an outside group of shareholders can try to obtain votes via proxy. They can vote by proxy in an attempt to replace management by electing enough directors of their choosing. Okay, so this battle is called proxy fight. Unlisted companies may have different procedure. For example, consider a cooperative farm such as Murray Goulburn Cooperative Company Limited, in which a group of sellers or producers come together to form a cooperative business to obtain better economies for selling their product. Cooperative companies are permitted to have different shareholder rules. For example, to be a shareholder of Murray Goulburn, you must be a dairy farmer who supplies milk to the cooperative. Now let's talk about other rights. The value of a share in a corporation is directly related to the general rights of shareholders. In addition to the right to vote for directors, shareholders usually have some other rights, okay? For example, the right to share proportionally in dividends paid, the right to share proportionally in assets remaining after liabilities have been paid in liquidation, and the right to vote on shareholders matter of great importance as set out in the articles of association, such as a merger. Voting is usually done at annual meeting or a special meeting. In addition, shareholders sometimes have the right to share proportionally in any new share sold, which is called a right issue. Essentially, a rights issue means that a company that wishes to sell new shares offer them to the existing shareholders on a pro rata basis to their existing shareholders. The purpose is to give shareholders the opportunity to protect their proportionate ownership in the corporation. Okay, now let's talk about dividends. A distinctive feature of corporation is that they have shares on which they are authorized by law to pay dividends to their shareholders. So we all know that dividends paid to shareholders represent a return on the capital directly or indirectly contributed to the corporation by the shareholders. The payment of dividend is at the discretion of the board of directors. So there are some important characteristics of dividends. First of all, unless a dividend is declared by the board of directors of a corporation, it's not a liability of the corporation. A corporation cannot default on an undeclared dividend. Okay, that means if a company fails to pay dividend, that doesn't lead the company to a bankruptcy. As a consequence of not paying dividend, corporations cannot be placed in liquidation. An amount of dividend or even whether it is paid are decisions based on the business judgment of the board of directors. The payment of dividends by the corporation is not a business expense. Dividends are not deductible for corporate tax purposes. In short, dividends are paid out of the corporation's after-tax profits. Okay. And the last point is dividends received by individual shareholders are for the most part considered ordinary income by the tax office. However, for Australian firms, the dividend imputation system, we learned it in chapter 2, dividend imputation system means that Australian shareholders receive a rebate for the tax paid by the firm in Australia. The tax effect of the dividend will depend on the marginal tax rate of the individual receiving the dividend and the franking credit. Now, preference shares. Preference shares differ from ordinary shares because they have preference over ordinary shares in the payment of dividends and in the distribution of corporate assets in the event of liquidation. Preference shares means only that the shareholders of the preference share must receive the dividend before ordinary shareholders are entitled to anything. Okay. A preference share is a form of equity from a legal and tax standpoint. So it's important to note, however, that holders of preference shares sometimes have no voting privileges. And the preference shares also have a stated liquidation value. Most firms have $100 face value per share, right? However, some firms may have a different value. Preference shares also can have cumulative and non-cumulative dividends. So preferred share dividend is not like interests on a bond. The board of directors may decide not to pay dividends on preference shares, and their decision may have nothing to do with the company having the funds available to pay a preferred share dividend. Okay, and again, the not paying dividend, preferred dividend, doesn't lead the company to bankruptcy. Okay, dividends payable on preference shares are either cumulative or non-cumulative. In most cases, they are cumulative. If preferred dividends are cumulative and not paid in a particular year, they will be carried out as an arrear. Okay, usually both the accumulated, that means unpaid past preferred dividend, and the current preferred dividend must be paid before any dividends can be paid to the ordinary shareholders. Okay, but keep it in mind that unpaid preferred dividends are not debts of the firms. So directors elected by the ordinary shareholders can defer preferred dividends indefinitely. However, in such cases, ordinary shareholders must also forego dividends. In addition, holders of preference shares are often granted voting and other rights if preferred dividends have not been paid for some time. Because preference shares holders receive no interest on the accumulated dividends, some have argued that firms have an incentive to delay paying preference shares, but this may mean holding control with preference shareholders. Okay, so this is essentially the feature of preferred shares and dividends. So that's the end of our discussion in this video. Thank you very much.